Hi everyone, it's Joe from Windrush Wargamers, and I want to talk to you about kit bashing. A few people in the comments have suggested that I make a video about kit bashing itself as opposed to specific projects. So I hope I can help where I can. If you are a prolific kit basher already, then this might not be the video for you. But if you're just getting started, this could help you along with your hobby journey. In this video, I will be covering what kit bashing is, why it can be useful, the tools of the trade, and then we'll put what we've learned into practice with a simple kit bash together. I remember my first exposure to kit bashing and conversions was Doc Butcher Conversion Clinic articles in White Dwarf magazine. The articles documented chopping bits off of models and combining them with other kits, and was written from the first person account of a Warhammer orc. This gave me tips on techniques and inspiration and showed me a whole different way to view the miniature hobby and model kits in general. In many ways, it was the first thing that opened the door to conversions for me, and I remember it was freeing to see as a kid that you could combine different kits to make something unique. And that, in essence, is what kit bashing really is. Kit bashing is where the main feature of the miniature modification is the combination of parts, and I would say that sculpting on kit bashes is kept to a minimum. So it's basically used as a way to blend kits together as opposed to being the main feature of a conversion. It could be summarized like this: kit bashes are conversions, but not all conversions are kit bashes. Now we know what it is, let's ask ourselves, why would someone kit bash? The first could simply be personalization of an army or individual miniatures. This can be helpful if you simply dislike the look of official miniatures. Maybe they look very different in your own head, or you want something closer to how they're described in whichever lore you follow. That's one of the great things about this side of the hobby, their exploration of themes that are only hinted at in the lore. Take my Void Shrikes for example. There are no official models, but they are referenced in several articles of the lore. Therefore, I made my own. Or you could just be doing something completely random and combining two fandoms together, like these Eldar Harlequins, which I kit bashed into Batman's Rogue Gallery. Weapon swaps are another great use for kit bashing. Some game systems have specific rules for each weapon, so adding more powerful weapons or weapons that give you different abilities can give you a tactical edge on the battlefield. And if you play against opponents that insist on what you see is what you get, sometimes you're going to need to bash your own weapons together to ensure that you have the most powerful weapons available. Another use for kit bashing could be creating models that do not have representation in a game system. So I predominantly play Middle-earth SPG. It's a brilliant game system, but unfortunately there's plenty of miniatures that aren't represented with official miniatures. Most of these are mounted options or different weapon options, or even entire captains are completely missing. So kit bashing is practically expected in this instance. Lastly, kit bashing can be a great way to save money. Many times there are opportunities to save money by combining unofficial miniatures and bulk out your force to make them unique, all the while saving a tidy sum. In particular, historical kits seem to be very reasonably priced. Now we've learned some good applications of kit bashing, we need to ask ourselves, where do we find the parts? Spare bits from the official kits are a great way to find parts. Take a look at this sprue from the Death Guard for instance. These Plague Marines have plenty of extra bits that can be used, and sprues always come in handy, so make sure you store them. Often kits will come with more arms and heads than they have bodies and legs, so these are ripe for repurposing. If you can find decent enough proxies for the body and legs, you can repurpose those official bits and really bulk out your force for a lot cheaper. Frequently, I've seen kit bashes online between Games Workshop heads and arms and unofficial bodies and legs, be they 3D prints, third parties, whichever. This allows bashers to make the most of the official bits and save some cash in the process. 3D prints can also be great for the parts themselves, either as STLs or through some small sellers, who print them out and sell them on places like eBay and Etsy. Here's an example I found on eBay to match Middle-earth SPG, compatible weapons and shields. As mentioned before, historicals are really awesome for price. They're a great source of excellent extra bits if you play fantasy in particular without using a heroic scale, so true scale. then historicals might just be the proxies for you. In particular, kits like from Perry Miniatures or Fireforge Games or Warlord Games, there's many more, too many to name here. But the kits often come with tons of spare heads and weapons, additionally things like capes and banners and instruments, which can work really well to augment your army. The trick will be mixing an army with a similar cultural appearance to the one you're trying to create. Lastly, some people make bespoke weapons and shields themselves, as opposed to making them as part of another kit. Here's an example from Footsore Miniatures, but others are available. This could be a great way to get something specific if you don't want all the extra chaff. But if you're a kit basher like me, you might enjoy all the extra bits for future projects. I think one thing to keep in mind is the scale of miniatures, and so when you're combining different miniature kits, be wary of how they might look together. For example, a good example of this for me is my conversion of the Iron Hills Goat Riders. The goats themselves look pretty nice that I used, but I think that the legs were much too wide, so I had to use Perry miniature legs. This was an extra step and it added a little bit more hassle, but in the long run it worked out for the best. Now we've established what kit bashing is, and we have some parts to bash together, we now need to have a look at the tools of the trade. First up, you'll need some snippers. These are practically hobby essentials. You can't go wrong with a good pair of snippers. Normally, I have one neat pair and one scuffed up pair. The scuffed up pair are used for clipping bits off the sprue, and the cleaner snippers are used for work on the actual miniature. Things like clipping away excess material, maybe scraping away mold lines occasionally. You'll want to have craft knives for the precision cuts. I sometimes use a Stanley knife as well for the thicker parts. If you are a kid, please get adult supervision. Hobby saws. They can either be the larger hacksaw types for large pieces, perhaps monsters or vehicles, to even smaller hobby saws, which are seen here. These are perfect for miniatures and weapons and all the rest of it. Saws allow you to go carefully when you're making a cut to help ensure to not remove any added material that you wanted to remain intact. Take this head swap for instance. I wanted to keep the banner in place behind, so I had to saw the metal at the neck from both sides very slowly and then saw behind the head, and then I was able to pry it loose with some pliers. A timely process, but it did ensure that all the detail I wanted to remained. Drills. Now hobby drills aren't crucial, but they're great for techniques like pinning. This helps secure areas where the connection point is actually too small and therefore could break off at later points or during gameplay. Also, drilling out gun barrels and making battle damage is a great use for drills. So they might not be the first tool you buy, but they can be a nice addition further down the line. Glues. Now if you're getting started, then super glue can be used for any material that are used to print miniatures, and therefore cheap ones can be really good. However, I would recommend using Gorilla Glue gel. This is a thick gel, which means more precision. Quite often with cheaper liquid super glue, it can get clogged, and when you squeeze hard to break the clog, it sometimes spurts out and ruins some of the detail on your miniatures. There's no such problems with Gorilla Glue gel though. It's quite pricey, but for me, I think it's worth every penny. After you become more established in the hobby, I would recommend picking up some plastic glue as well. Plastic glue is a chemical which melts the plastic down, therefore it can really fuse a strong bond together. But it is quite a long working time, and if you forget, you can knock bits loose if it hasn't fully cured. This long working time, however, can be used to our advantage when making kit bashes. You can spend longer posing a miniature just right, and then let it set in place. It's probably worth here mentioning something like sprue goo. This is a great material, although you'll have to make it yourself. All you have to do is clip off bits of spare sprue and drop it into some plastic glue. The spare sprue melts and creates this thick gloop. Sprue goo is great for gap filling. Simply apply it to the area and then use a clean brush, so from your regular plastic glue, to wipe it smooth. Because the plastic is already a component within the goo, you can use it on non-plastic models too, like resin and like metal. It works in a similar fashion to how liquid green stuff was expected to work, but it actually does work, unlike liquid green stuff. Speaking of gap filling, sculpting putties are great for gap filling, blending between kits together, or even sculpting some detail. You might not need these for every kit, but if there's something specific in mind, these can be really great. The last thing I want to mention here are rotary tools. They're a bit specialist, but rotary tools are great for cutting and sanding. However, due to their size and power, you could risk damaging miniatures, but they could be really good for things like vehicles, for terrain, or even things like monsters. Here's an example of me kit bashing some terrain using a rotary tool. Cuts through the plastic like butter. Once again, if you're a child, don't do this at home. We've established what kit bashing is, why it's useful, and what you'll need to do it. So now, let's have a bash ourselves, and put what we've learned into practice. In previous videos, I've said that kit bashing is like building a 3D puzzle, but there's no instructions and there's no set pieces. Let's work through a simple scenario and implement what we've learned. Let's say you buy a squad of Death Guard Plague Marines. You've spent all day putting everyone's favourite smelly bloated traitors together. You've even taken the time to paint up a test model to see how your colour scheme works. But then you realise something. In the corner of the Poxwalker sprue is a spare body and legs. This I think was left over from the Dark Imperium box, where you used to get Poxwalkers and Plague Marines in the same kit. As we mentioned earlier, this seldom happens. The spare bits are typically things like heads and arms, so this is a rarity indeed, and essentially it means that if we're wise, we can kit bash an 8th Death Guard model for free. Luckily, the model is green, so we can see exactly what parts have been kit bashed on, which will help us visually in the video. The left arm and the head should be simple enough, just need gluing in place, but we need to consider the following areas. The first problem is the front of the torso is missing. Anything can be used, but it will have to look natural. Next, there is half a shoulder pad. This will need to be removed because it's not going to match up anything that we have in the sprue. And lastly, the power pack slotter is rectangular and won't fit with the circular void that stands in most of the Plague Marine power packs. Now the good news is we don't have to make any considerations to scale or where to source our spare parts, as the Plague Marine sprue is rife with spare bits that will fit this miniature both tonally and also to scale. Like building anything, we're going to have to do a bit of demolition, so the first place to start is removing that shoulder pad. This is done with the hobby saw, starting with drawing cuts to establish a groove, and then sawing in an accurate motion to separate it from the cape and the shoulder respectively. We will try to keep as much detail as we possibly can. The most destructive steps should be done first, because sometimes you can risk breaking off parts of the miniature which you've already glued in place if you start having to grip the model firmly to saw or cut bits away. The cut is then cleaned with a craft knife, scraping along the edge, and it's also used to gouge out the remaining plastic from the cape. This will give us more room for when we put our new shoulder pad in place. With the right shoulder pad removed, this gives us now a really good foundation to build a kit bash on. So next I move on to the torso. This is required as it makes a nice canvas to build up the head and also the shoulders from. There are many spare options from the Death Guard Plague Marine kit. The spiked torso does match the rest of the armour, as there's clearly spikes protruding from his knees and his feet, but this for me is too small. You can see the top of the legs, and so I wanted to use a larger bloated one. This is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for us and mean that we have to do less sculpting later on. Sometimes sculpting is unavoidable, but here I think we can get around it with some clever choices. These tabs here would have to be removed so it would be a clear flat surface for a good connection. And then the torso is glued in place using some plastic cement. I cleared the rectangular tab from the rear of the model using my snippers and scraped it clean. I then glued the power pack in place. For this, I used a combination of plastic glue on the flat areas, but I filled the void with some sprue goo. This filled the void and increased the connection point, making the surface way more secure. With this in place, I can move on to the right arm. We can use a standard bolter arm. This can be attached with plastic glue to the shoulder joint and also to the clog for some added connection points. The head was then simply glued in place before I could move on to the right arm. A good tip is, after every step, Pick up the miniature and have a look round to see if there's any bits that are missing or any parts of the kit that don't fully match. So this last step was to cover the left side underneath the arm, because it's not covered by the cape, which is on the right side, and therefore you can see that the torso kits don't quite match. The way round this for me, instead of sculpting, I opted to cover this up. I could have reached for this part of the cloak, which is on the sprue, but instead I chose to put a different texture in there and use this small patch of chainmail. The chainmail was nearly perfect for this, but it did need to be trimmed down at the top to make sure that it fit the shape of the torso correctly. So it was clipped down with some clippers and glued in place with some plastic glue. And here we are, a free model made of spare bits that were just going to go to waste. I only needed clippers, a saw, a knife and some glue. We didn't even use half of the techniques or the tools that we mentioned earlier in the video. A very simple and tidy kit bash. On the turntable you might be able to see a tiny bit of green stuff sculpting. That was just to blend the kits together at the end. So thanks for making it through the end of the video. Hopefully you've got all the tools and the know-how to start your kit bashing journey. So let me know what you thought of the video in the comment section. If you have any ideas for me to cover in the future, let me know. We have a fairly extensive back catalogue now of Warhammer 40k and Middle-earth SBG topics and projects, so feel free to search through them. There's plenty of kit bashes in there. Like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't. I normally always forget to mention this at the end of the videos, but we have a buy me a coffee, so if I remember to put the link down, feel free to give us a tip if you'd like to. It's not a subscription service, just a one-off. Thanks in advance. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss anything. Like the video if you liked it, dislike the video if you didn't like it. Thanks for watching. I've been Joe, I'll catch you in the next one.